David Tereshchuk joins us just about every single Friday that there is at this time, and he joins us with the Media Beat. Now, David has his own website, which is called themediabeat.us, themediabeat.us. He's a PBS television correspondent reporting on ethics and belief, and we're very lucky to have him join us on Friday mornings and take a look at what the media is covering and how they're covering it. Good morning, David. David, are you there? Have we lost David? You there? Oh, that's bizarre. David, can you hear us? No, you can't. We can hear him sniffling. That's no good. So we'll try this again. See what happens. Hopefully we'll be able to get through him now. Are you there, David?
Yep, here I am. I'm glad to be reporting in again from the media capital of the world. Communications do sometimes work. I'm here in the media capital, New York City, and I'm glad to be joining the ever-vigilant Marshall Miles once again. Let's start, Marshall, shall we, with yesterday's congressional hearing?
Absolutely.
Almost certainly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I thought you might agree. Almost certainly the last public session of the House panel investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. It was presented with all of its now familiar televisual flair, and members left until the very last minute. The dramatic decision to subpoena ex-President Trump himself. As a media critic, I have to say that it was dramatic, only in that it was an emphatic piece of political theater, that subpoena vote. No one single member of that committee can really completely believe it's substantive that they're ever going to actually see Trump submitting to the subpoena. But there was more drama, of course, in the actual content of the hearing. Very compelling video footage from from inside the Capitol, footage of congressional leaders right in the thick of the event. Some remarkable considerations being played out or thought through in real time by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and others, including the Vice President, of course, and also new details available during the long hearing yesterday from the Secret Service, confirming how much it knew about the risks of violence well before the event on January the 6th itself. All part of this overall purpose of the committee now to emphasize just how central the former president was to this whole event, and subpoenaing him is just the inevitable cherry on top of the cake. Although debate about whether to do that or not has ebbed and flowed over the course of this committee's existence.
Well, looking at the whole picture as a whole, I was never. I'll be honest with you, I'm a convert. I thought that this was going to be a futile effort, and it's not going to be. They did uncover and release information to the American people that people didn't know before. They do have a strong case together. The people that they've had testify before them have been both Republicans and Democrats and independents, also have been supporters or non-supporters of the president. And in the end, even though people are saying, well, there might be a change of House leadership and this and that, it doesn't matter. When they wrap up their hearings, finally, it's not their job to move it forward. It is the Justice Department's job, whether or not they want to take this forward or not. And so it will take with this. So that's why I think this has been very, very successful.
Well, I suppose the overall point to make was made by the vice chair of the committee hearing yesterday, Liz Cheney, representative from Wyoming. She's Republican, of course, and I heard in a lot of the coverage in broadcast versions of it yesterday, reporters continuing to say, unaccountably to my mind, that the committee is a Democratic committee. Well, yeah, I mean, it was set up by Democrats and predominated by Democrats, of course, and quite deliberately, the leader, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, declined to take on board the people that the Republicans suggested at one point could be representing the Republican side on the committee. But it did have two members who are Republican, including Liz Cheney herself as the vice chair. And I think the lasting impact, I think, overall, the kind of overall impact you were talking about just then, Marshall, was well voiced by Liz Cheney herself when she was saying that the overarching questions for the future remain the salient issues that will face us long after this committee is gone. The center held, as it were, during this terrible event. And it held, she was careful to point out, because men and women in positions of responsibility stayed true to their oath of office or their commitment just because of their professional position in helping to maintain our democracy. Democracy was not overturned because of these brave and dutiful Americans. And that while that remains a remarkable and positive achievement, who's to say that it would happen that way next time if anything like this were to happen again? And that, of course, is the overall purpose of this committee: decide policy to avoid such terrible things happening again. And as she said, our purpose is to lay out a program for making sure it doesn't happen again. And of course, in terms of executive action following this, that will be up to the Justice Department mainly. But the probing and the raising of the issues and the manner in which it was allowed to get so out of hand as it did, that has been absolutely the achievement of this committee so far.
And the depth of the conspiracy, which I think a lot of people didn't look at, the depth of the conspiracy that went everywhere from associates of the president, former president, to possibly people in the House itself, and that out into the general public. That was all laid very bare and open to the public and backed with facts. And I think that was one of the most important parts of what this committee has done.
Yeah, a case laid out. To have a case actually tried is a separate matter, and we'll see if that actually happens. You know, Marshall, it's tempting to look only at media coverage of this divided, polarized nation, that's made so obvious in events like yesterday's at the highest national level in our nation's capital. But I want to fly this week, as it were, to another country and sort of back in time. I'm in fact looking back toward my own one-time home, London. Now, it's time for our fanfare. We often celebrate a particularly good example of media work with our trademark fanfare, but this week I really wish we had a whole array, a barrage of trumpets to sound out our appreciation for a really big, huge contribution by a remarkably big media organization. Let's hear our fanfare for the BBC, which is about to celebrate its 100th birthday. Can we hear it? blown trumpet, but still deserved, I think. The British Broadcasting Corporation. You don't often hear the initials spelt out in full like that. Corporation. When the BBC was initially founded on October the 18th, the birthday in 1922, the birthday will be next Tuesday. It was in fact, the C in BBC was in fact standing simply for company. It was in fact a grouping of 6 companies, communications businesses, including Marconi's company, Wireless Telegraph and Signal. But within 5 years, it was to become much more grandiosely what the documents called a body corporate, endowed with both that corporation title and a royal charter setting it up, signed by the king at the time, or at least the royal signature was applied in some way. It was designed in part to protect it as an independent entity from commercial or political pressures. And since then, of course, in those 100 years, it's spread into a gargantuan worldwide conglomerate we all recognize. Although it's still quintessentially British, I have to say. Just let me sound a few personal notes here. A measure of its Britishness is that among a certain class of Brits, it's still known kind of affectionately as Auntie, a label that I think originated in its indelible tendency toward nannying its audience a bit. It's a tendency that nowadays its best output mercifully avoids, but it's definitely there in its history, that nannying. And to be fair, a more neutral nickname is the familiar, even chummy abbreviation of the abbreviation. So we end up with a single syllable. The Beeb, much loved and often very much decried too. It's hard, Marshall, well nigh impossible to know exactly what to say in recognition of this century-long contribution to the world, especially in view of the BBC's, hydra-headed expanse and its enormous variety. I mean, it's well known for its music. I mean, the man in charge of celebrating these 100 years is a former head of BBC Music. Music is central to the BBC's existence. But it's, comedy and drama, but all of those things are well recognized around the world. But journalism remains my concern and our concern in this slot every week. And the BBC's role in journalism is again just enormous, well nigh indescribable. And that role has been right there. It's been central right from the beginning. One of the primary objectives in that original charter that I mentioned is, let me quote it from the 1920s document, to collect news of and information relating to current events in any part of the world and in any manner that may be thought fit. That was its mandate, and the Beeb has indeed become its own news agency. That word, that news agency, all that single compound word, is right there in the 1920s document, prefiguring the sort of verbal usages we have now in the internet age. And it's been, of course, gathering news internationally and omnivorously. The way it's evaluated and then transmitted this news material afresh outward to its audiences has rightly earned respect and trust worldwide. I'd say it's a journalistic legend now, renowned as a fountainhead of reliable news and analysis, the kind that people who live under dictatorships will always turn to when their own local news is repressed or distorted by a government's control or censorship. Now, I've always felt, I want to make this a personal tribute. In my own international assignments, I always felt it essential to keep in touch by listening to the BBC World Service. In days of yore, for me, it was crackling through a transistor radio I carried everywhere, often in the remotest and frankly really uncomfortable locations. And more recently, of course, it's crystal clear online via my laptop or using the BBC's own smartphone app. And, you can actually hear it on the radio as well. So, now, during the London slice of my career, 1969 to 1990, I was largely employed by the UK's commercial ITV network. So I was working in direct competition with the BBC. So it's as a competitor, really, that I can really vouch for its incomparable standards. Though, as we all know, any institution can slip, and as the BBC regrettably has done at times. And here in this slot, you and I have highlighted some of those less successful moments for the BBC. But it's overall, I have to express my respect. And for complete disclosure, I should admit I was hired by the corporation for my very first job after college, and I left after only 2 weeks. As an impatient 20-something, I just couldn't bear the institutional atmosphere, interestingly. I condemned it at the time as like working for the civil service. But as I say, I was an impatient 20-something. Mercifully for me at the time, an ITV executive offered me a better job in a better location too, and more lucratively paid. So I had to go. And then long after that period, when I was operating as a freelance, I was commissioned by the World Service to make some radio documentaries from Africa, different countries in Africa, notably Zimbabwe and Zambia. And I can only applaud the rigor and exactness I encountered among the World Service producers and editors with whom I ended up completing the broadcast. I really felt I should make amends for the arrogance of my young days. But there we are. I want to doff my cap respectfully to the cavalcade of BBC celebrations that's about to juggernaut over all our airwaves and online next week, starting the 18th of October, recalling 1922.
You look at the BBC, and all we have to compare it to here in this country is our networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox. And for how long the BBC has been around, it still is one of the leading organizations in correspondence around the world. America and its networks have gone the easy route and have gotten rid of most of their foreign correspondents. I say most, it's just a few are left, where the BBC really does apply itself to bring that news from correspondence in the field, not from news that's been in the field that's been filtered down and handed down. I think they've maintained their dignity and their evenness far better than any other news organizations I can possibly think of.
Yeah, I mean, on a point of detail, the NPR has actually been increasing its overseas representation and the numbers of its bureaus. But of course, the BBC is by far the biggest international footprint, has the biggest international footprint. CNN in this country tries hard, but it has a long way to go to match the BBC. And indeed, even the CNN has been afflicted by the cost-cutting drives too, and has cut back on some of its overseas bureaus. But the quality question is still the major one, and the sense of what journalism is. I could swing to the opposite end of the scale immediately and draw attention this week to some reprehensible effort at journalism by way of contrast with the BBC. The story this week got a huge push from the Fox News network. Very different kettle of fish from the BBC, as you said. It began this week with the government's Drug Enforcement Agency putting out one of its periodic warning bulletins to the public about fentanyl, mentioning that the drug comes in many different forms, including small pills as well as other, familiar medically delivered forms like adhesive patches. And all those pills often come in a variety of different colors, as they have done for some time now. But Fox News decided to seize on this as a Halloween story, claiming this was an effort to get fentanyl into kids' candy as they go trick-or-treating. It's a classic scare story designed to scare the bejesus out of parents of young children. Now, the DEA administrator, Ann Milligram, said very carefully, she pointed out, we have not seen any connection to Halloween. Fox News interviewed her, and she made that very clear. But Fox railroaded over that and went on amping the story up as a threat that so-called rainbow fentanyl will be appearing inside Halloween candy bags. I mean, it's just, words fail me about Fox News sometimes, but that was a particularly egregious example. And I'm glad to say that the record was set straight, or a literally manful effort was made to put this record straight by NPR. Its addiction correspondent, Brian Mann, who used to be in the North Country Public Radio, north of you, Marshall, tried to put that whole thing in perspective and was able to report there is no new fentanyl threat Halloween for children. But it was just another reminder of what journalism is and how journalism can sometimes get totally distorted by so-called news organizations like Fox.
Well, but that's why I point out the BBC. Yes, every organization has its times where all the safeguards they put in effect fail for some reason or another, mostly human error or oversight. But I think that they've by far done the best of all the news organizations that I've seen, and that goes from Al Jazeera and Vice, which they, by the way, those two organizations do very decent jobs, Axios and stuff. I still think that the BBC deserves all the plaudits it gets. I mean, that's why when Jill and I, when we started this radio station, the network we wanted was the BBC as our major news network, just simply because you get news from around the world, and you get it on a totally even-handed perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of media reporting this week, too, Marshall, on President Biden ordering a rethink in our relations with Saudi Arabia, since that kingdom, reported internationally by the BBC, is better possibly than anybody else, as usual. But Saudi Arabia is effectively ruled by its murderous butcher-in-chief, let's call him, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS for short. It chose to side this week with Russia in agreeing within the OPEC Plus cartel to cut down on oil production and so force oil prices up again. In so doing, the prince was, of course, performing in exactly opposite direction to what President Biden had wanted him to do when the president made that shameful trip back in July to meet the butcher-in-chief. Remember, you and I talked about this at the time, a shameful sort of kowtowing, it seemed, in public view, to be almost begging the Crown Prince, and this in the face of that despicable track record that MBS has, having ordered the abduction of a Washington Post columnist, Jamal Khashoggi, and ended up with his body being cut to pieces inside Saudi diplomatic premises. But now the White House has ordered a rethink, and I suppose we can be grateful for that.
Yeah, it's when we turn to take a look at media coverage of things exactly like that, there are things the United States can do and should do. It puts us at greater risk of paying a little bit more money for fuel and energy for ourselves. But people seem to forget the number one producer of oil in the world is the United States. Unfortunately, by far, we are the number one user of oil in the world as well. But just getting back to take a look what's going on, I have one more story, and that is that what's going on in the Ukraine with Russia now voluntarily. They can't seem to win the war on the ground. So what they are doing basically is now attacking civilians, not military targets, civilian targets. And the Ukraine is asking for better air support. This is an example of exactly how bad Vladimir Putin is in a corner, and why you can't trust him to not do the ultimate thing, because you can't win it. He can't win this war on the ground, so he will just kill people to try to win it that way. And the media is covering it. They're covering it more overseas than they are here, but this is a sight we haven't seen really since Germany decided to go after populations and try to exterminate them. It is a terrifying sight to see.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see some media outlets trying to take a broad historical view of this. What is happening now, of course, is that fallback to a reliance upon long-range attacks by long-range bombers, and of course rocket-powered missiles directed, and inevitably, however much they may claim that they're pinpointing military targets, we know what the actual effect of that is. It's an attack on civilians and an attack on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. And the broadest of questions, thinking strategically and trying to analyze things strategically, is that this has been tried before in many parts of the world. It's a development of the mid 20th century. The Spanish Civil War, I suppose, was where the Nazis helped the Spanish fascists there in an experimental way, and went on, the Nazis did, to practice it to terrible immediate effect against my old home country, Britain. Its effects on Britain are now sort of legendary in two different ways. The Blitz of London, for instance, was devastatingly fatal to the civilian population, but at the same time, it sparked extraordinary resilience, and that word resilience keeps coming up in the Ukrainian coverage for everybody. And we saw it in Korea, in the Korean War, and we saw it in the Vietnam War, when Americans tried to bomb the North Vietnamese into submission. And inevitably, it seems that history tells us that populations are not going to be cowed by this. The immediacy of the attack upon them makes it a lot more dramatic for the civilian population, and their involvement is almost guaranteed. A distant war, of course, or a war fought only by professional soldiers, can somehow be filtered out a little bit. But for the Ukrainians, this cannot be filtered out, and the evidence shows historically that this is a war that cannot be won this way. That, of course, doesn't mean that Putin won't keep on trying to push it, but its effects, I think, taking the long-term view, are not necessarily those of are not going to end in some kind of scorched earth victory by Russia. That is not what is going to happen here.
Well, it's always interesting, David. Week by week we take a look at the media and what the media covers, and you do a great job. TheMediaBeat.us is his website. David, we'll speak to you next week.
Look forward to that. Bye now.
David Tereshchuk with the Media Beat. Once again, you can find him on our website, RobinHoodRadio.com. Click on demand, click on the Media Beat at his website, TheMediaBeat.us.